In the summer of 2017, Bring Out Your Dead Productions, a regional theatre company, teamed up with Moyses Hall Museum to develop a community project that would engage people across East Anglia with the history of the witch trials. Thanks to a grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund, Witches of West Suffolk was born.
The Witches of West Suffolk is a large community-led heritage project that explores the history of the East Anglian Witch Trials, which took place across East Anglia between 1645 and 1647. So the project comprised of a lot of different elements. So we started off with a community research group and workshops in schools. Based on the research that was gathered, that was then all turned into a play that was performed at Moyses Hall Museum last year. And now there's some more community participation events. So we've got this film, and we've got a special self-guided walk around Bury St Edmunds coming up that takes walkers to all the different parts of Bury that were affected by the trials.
Another part of the research phase was that we went into local schools and worked with the students. We did a bit of debunking. For example, in England, witches were not burnt at the stake, they were hanged. And we worked with them through drama games and exercises, and it was great fun. And then we also took the students to Moyses Hall Museum and to the local records office. We wanted to do a documentary of the project because the play happened and then it's gone. The walk will happen and it will go. But having a film about everything we've discovered, the surprising bits, the truths and the lies, it's going to last forever and can be shown to as many people as possible. Also, it's another way for another completely different group of people in the community to explore the history of the time and to experience it for themselves, be you a cameraman, a producer, a volunteer actor, or a passerby who happens to be there on the filming day.
What we really wanted to achieve with this project is to present the history of the story in such a way that it forces people to look beyond the sensationalism of what they think they already know about the events, and to start thinking about the real life stories of the real human beings who were affected by this terrible tragedy, and leave a lasting legacy for those people.
East Anglia, 1645. England is being torn apart by bloody civil war. Parliament has turned upon the king. Neighbour has turned upon neighbour. The world has turned upside down. Matthew Hopkins was a minor gentleman in his early 20s. Little is known about Hopkins' life outside of his witch-finding activities, but we know that, unlike his older brothers, Hopkins did not go to university or embark on a professional career, and that, in 1645, he seemed quite content living off his inheritance in the village of Missley.
So Matthew Hopkins, the so-called Witchfinder General, has come down to us as a kind of bogeyman in folklore. He's a thoroughly evil and twisted, malevolent being, and that almost as if he hadn't existed historically, you'd have had to have made him up. But he really did exist. He was a real historical figure, but inevitably he has been misunderstood, I think, precisely because of these mythic distortions of the real character. So that we don't know a tremendous amount about Matthew Hopkins. We know he was probably born around the year 1620 in the parish of Great Wenham in Suffolk. He was the son of a clergyman, and he was born and grew up in an environment which was where religion was very sharply contested between the rather ceremonialist church of Archbishop Laud and Charles I, which Puritans on the other side saw as rather Catholic and popish and superstitious. And so that Hopkins's father, James Hopkins, was himself a Puritan who believed that the church should be stripped of these kinds of ornamentations, and that the Puritans, and like all Puritans, that one should only worship according to the Bible and to prayer. They were like the two big things.
In the isolated rural villages and towns of the largely Puritan East Anglia, the war exacerbated conflicts between neighbours. Parliamentary propaganda that spoke of Armageddon and the diabolical practices of the royalists gave neighbourly suspicion a supernatural new edge.
One of the things about early modern witch trials is they don't just come out of nowhere. They're not they sometimes seem like sudden explosions, but they're not just knee-jerk reactions to individual anxieties or just the desire to get rid of someone. So throughout the 1630s, in this area of the Stour Valley between Essex and Suffolk, there have been very few witch trials. Under Charles I as an Archbishop Lord, there has been a suppression of these, well, I suppose the expression of these rather puritanical demonological obsessions. But that doesn't mean to say, of course, that there wasn't actually a build-up of social anxiety and of fear and of the genuine belief that there are witches out there that are trying to kill you, destroy your livestock, hurt your children and so on. So that a lot of this is kind of building up below the radar, so that when we get to the winter of 1644 to 5 and the bewitching of a woman called Goodwife Rivet, then actually what you see then hasn't just come from nowhere. This is actually the tip of an iceberg. But like I suppose, we can't necessarily see what lay beneath it.
In the Essex town of Manningtree, a tailor by the name of John Rivet spent the winter of 1644 by his wife's bedside. She had been struck down by a mysterious illness that had caused fever and paralysis. Fearing for her life, and having exhausted the limited medical and spiritual remedies available, John Rivet turned to magic. He sought the advice of a cunning woman, a sort of good witch who practised healing magic and divination. The cunning woman told John Rivet that his wife had been cursed by a neighbour. For John Rivet, only one neighbour could have been guilty: Elizabeth Clark.
But what we can feel sure of is that people were very angry by then, and so that a lot of accusations and suspicions of beliefs start to sort of creep out of the woodwork. And it takes one thing to catalyse that, and that is particularly this bewitching, which then was attached to a woman called Elizabeth Clark. So the husband of the bewitched woman goes to a cunning woman who, by some process in his head, identifies Elizabeth Clark. Whether she actually said her name, we don't know, but he comes back convinced that Elizabeth Clark, who lives close to him, is the source of his household's misfortunes, particularly his wife's illness. And from that point, that's when I think perhaps some of the inhibitions about accusing someone of witchcraft, given that it was very unlikely that one was going to have a successful lawsuit, suddenly fall away, and then from that point, as happens with witch hunts, it starts to gather momentum.
In the early days of 1645, John Sterne, a gentleman from Lawshall, came to Manningtree. Sterne's friendly connections with the Essex magistrates were well known, and a number of villagers came to speak with Sterne about Elizabeth Clark. A few days prior, they had accosted the widow Clark and publicly accused her of witchcraft. A record of her remarks was made and handed to Sterne. The practice for examining a witch was well established. First, the suspected witch was detained in his or her home at the order of the local magistrates. The accused was then stripped naked and searched by a jury of matrons, local women with experience as midwives, to find any suspicious marks or growths that might be teats for suckling imps. Finally, the accused was watched by local men and women in the village. These watchings would go on for days, with a suspected witch deprived of sleep and provided with little food or water. Respite would come only when the suspect confessed, or their imps appeared to them, thereby proving their guilt.
One of the important ways in the mid-17th century of trying to determine whether or not a witch was guilty, an alleged witch, was to watch her. And so what happens to Elizabeth Clark is that she's sat on a chair, probably in her own home, and then she is watched, as many other witches would be subsequently, very closely, probably in near silence, probably in conditions also of near darkness. So there may well have been a candle or a rushlight, maybe the light from a fire, given that this was still winter time. And that this would have been an incredibly tense atmosphere, because those who were watching her, including subsequently John Sterne, Matthew Hopkins, would have really believed that she was a witch, and would have really believed, as English people tended to believe, that witches had diabolical familiars that took the shape of different kinds of animal, sometimes familiar animals, sometimes bizarre hybrids. And so that Elizabeth Clark is questioned over a period of time. Now, again, we're never quite sure exactly what was happening over that period of time, of many hours, but that there does come a point where Elizabeth Clark cracks. And again, whether she's just telling the inquisitors what they want to hear, or whether through some kind of suggestibility and exhaustion on her part, maybe some kind of mental impairment, perhaps just a yearning for this interrogation to stop, she does confess to them that she is a witch. She names other witches in Manningtree and Mistley and the surrounding areas. And she also says that these creatures which witnesses say come into the room are her children, that these are the children and that their father was the devil. And again, it's a bit difficult. It's a bit like some of the phenomena in the seance room. People see different things because it's darkness, because they're suggestible, because they're in very heightened emotional states. And so not everybody agrees about the things that they've seen. But I think that the idea that they were just all making this up and they were saying they saw the devil's children and the whole thing was some kind of bogus conspiracy, I don't think is necessarily the case. I think it's perfectly possible that everybody in that room, maybe including Elizabeth Clark herself, believed that they were actually witnessing the damning phenomena of witchcraft.
John Sterne was acquainted with Matthew Hopkins and invited the young Puritan along to Elizabeth Clark's watching. During the watching, Hopkins became more and more involved, questioning the widow and coaxing out a confession. Hopkins and the others watching would claim that Elizabeth Clark summoned several imps into her hovel, that tormented and threatened them, and that one even followed Hopkins home and attacked his dog.
There is one piece of evidence in all witch trials which is often seen as the kind of the queen of proofs, as sometimes call it, and that is the confession. Now, in inquisitorial trials in continental Europe, they use torture. Torture is not a formal part of the English legal process. However, there are many other ways to get confessions, and one of which is to intimidate, to deny somebody sleep, and so on. Now, that in this case, that it is understood by Hopkins and others that maybe that there is some kind of secret conspiracy going on. These witches form a kind of coven. They are plotting together to bring down local society, local politics, and so on. So in any kind of conspiracy, if you're the investigator, the interrogator, what you really want is for somebody to turn evidence against the others.
As the Chelmsford Assizes grew closer, Hopkins paid the young Rebecca West a visit in the dark and foul jail at Colchester Castle. Over the course of his visit, he persuaded Rebecca to make a new confession, one which more clearly accused her mother of renouncing her baptism and making a pact with the devil.
That night the devil came to me.
In the shape of a tall, dark man.
In the shape of a tall, dark man.
he kissed you.
Hopkins, it seems, finds his opportunity in this rather impressionable girl, probably a teenager, called Rebecca West, who is induced to not just confess and implicate other women, but even her own mother. And I think that this is a truly dreadful part of the story, but in a state where actually that this teenage girl might actually be facing the gallows, she would actually even, implicate her mother. Maybe even be persuaded that her mother is actually a witch and she isn't herself, or maybe she was. It's very, very hard to say. But I think that, there's a sort of dissociation takes place when people are very afraid and put under a lot of pressure, which can actually perhaps lead them to think that, that they almost don't know their own minds, and that it could have seemed quite sensible, albeit absolutely tragic, for Rebecca West actually to have isolated herself from a group of women who she believed were actually going to hang.
Thanks to Hopkins' intervention, Rebecca would turn witness for the Crown, and the Manningtree coven would hang. Like all trials in the 17th century, the Chelmsford Assizes were treated almost as a form of entertainment, albeit one where the serious work of the Lord was carried out. Merchants lined the streets selling their wares, ballad sellers performed, and crowds turned out in their hundreds to see the wicked punished.
One of the things that Parliament seems to find so dreadful by the summer of 1645 is not just that the jails in Suffolk and Essex are full of witches, but that one of them is actually an ordained clergyman, an elderly man, a devout man, an ordained parish minister.
In the small village of Brandeston, Hopkins assisted in the investigation of John Lowes, an elderly rector with royalist sympathies, long accused of witchcraft by his Puritan parishioners.
And his story illustrates not just the real horrors, I think, of the witch hunt, given that an old man is tormented into confessing against himself and therefore is subsequently executed, but his story really lifts the lid on just how deep these animosities were in individual places, and again give the lie to the myth that somehow this was just a sort of a knee-jerk reaction to the period of the Civil War and social and political anxiety. Because the tensions between John Lowes over religion, and therefore more broadly about culture, between John Lowes and his parish have been going on for decades. And so he's been involved in witchcraft accusations before, and of harbouring an accused witch and so on. But, one might ask, why wasn't he apprehended before then? Well, it's because actually that those times of 1610, 1620, 1630s are not conducive to successful witch trials.
Lowes was pricked, interrogated, deprived of sleep and food, and forced to run to the point of exhaustion. Yet he refused to confess. There was only one option remaining to his accusers: the swimming trial. Swimming was the practice of binding an accused witch with rope and throwing them into a body of water, the belief being that pure water would reject the corrupted souls of the wicked, causing them to float, thus proving their wickedness. Subjecting an accused witch to the swimming trial was considered a form of torture, and therefore illegal. But folk superstition often trumped the law in isolated rural towns and villages. Whether he floated or sank, when Lowes was dragged from the river outside Framlingham Castle, he confessed to the crime of witchcraft. With over 150 men and women standing accused of witchcraft, the Bury St Edmunds Assizes captured the attention of Parliament, but not in the way Matthew Hopkins might have hoped.
What one finds with the East Anglian witch hunt is that there are sceptical voices, objecting voices here and there right from the beginning. There are doubts and that there are people who don't like what's happening, which doesn't necessarily have anything to do with them being sceptical of witchcraft, just about them having a distaste for the practice of witch hunting. Again, especially given that there is so much scepticism about the evidence that's used in witch trials.
Concerned that the witch-finders could be little more than charlatans, deceiving a weakened justice system and sending innocents to their death, a special commission of Oyez and Terminer was drawn up to scrutinise the trials. At the trial, John Godbold, the judge appointed by the special commission, condemned the witch-finders for their methods, and, in particular, reminded them that the swimming trial was forbidden by law. The jury would find only 18 of the 150 accused witches guilty. It seemed scepticism about the witch-finders and their methods was growing. As Hopkins and Sterne carried their crusade on into 1646, visiting Cambridgeshire, Bedfordshire and Norfolk, scepticism continued to grow. In Huntingdonshire, John Gall, a Puritan vicar, published a scathing pamphlet criticising Matthew Hopkins and his profession.
So you get little sort of glimmers of there being some kind of challenge to Hopkins in Colchester in 1645. But this seems to gather strength, or rather, if it's being heard all over the place, it comes to the fore in 1646, 1647. And that you get particularly a clergyman called John Gall in Huntingdonshire who sees a letter that comes from one of his parishioners from Hopkins saying, would I be welcome if I came to your parish? Again, Hopkins can't just go anywhere. It's all about, politically, about the art of the possible. There is danger in witch hunting. And so Hopkins wants to make sure he's going to the right places. Well, John Gall gets hold of this letter and starts preaching against witch hunting, which isn't necessarily a defence of witches, but it's very much against the idea that men in England should take authority upon themselves. It's a bid for the reimposition of order after this terrible bloodletting and chaos of the English Civil War.
The witch-finders persisted regardless, but they were unable to replicate the success of the Chelmsford Assizes, as fewer and fewer towns and villages were willing to invite them in or to give them their money.
So it's starting to become increasingly dangerous for him politically to practice his witch finding. And it goes to show again that the witch hunt takes place within quite a narrow window, when this is just about legally and politically and socially possible, but it's a window that closes almost as quickly as it opens.
In 1647, a panel of Norwich judges issued a series of probing questions for Hopkins, putting the witch-finder on trial in the court of public opinion. Hopkins published his arrogant and disingenuous responses in a pamphlet that did not enjoy the same success as John Gall's. Hopkins died from tuberculosis at his home in Mistley, aged just 27. Though John Sterne continued to hunt witches for a time, the thrill of the chase had faded, and the witch hunts ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Matthew Hopkins' crusade was enabled by a justice system and a country in chaos. It was not Hopkins who put the noose around the necks of so many innocent men and women. He came into communities with a sympathetic ear, validating the fears and suspicions of the locals and encouraging their accusations, but the blame cannot be laid at his feet alone. It takes a village to hang a witch. And if Hopkins's life tells us anything, it is that, with the right encouragement, any of us could start to see witches in our own neighbourhoods.
And 'tis all the hills
and follow